Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Leading Change Even If You Are Not in Charge by Jennifer Bonine. We are excited that you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in this series, Scenario-Based Development and Testing by Dr. Meg Hanna, on August 18th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to www.qualitymanagementconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at www.qualitymanagementconference.com. At the end of today's session, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Jennifer Bonine. Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. So let's start by defining change. So change really is a process, and it has a lot to do with where are you today and where are you trying to get. So the chart that we're looking at really talks about in order to successfully move through a change process, it's important to clearly understand your current state. A lot of people don't take the time at the beginning of a change process to understand current state. And it's very important to do that so that you remember where you started from. A lot of times people will start making changes without documenting that current state, and then they find that they don't feel like they've made as much progress as they actually have because they can't revert back to what current state actually is for them or their organization. So big recommendation for all of you out there who are looking at changes that you're trying to implement. Make sure you take the time to document what your current state looks like. Know that you're going to go through a transition period and that you're going to have to transition to what you want the future to look like. In that transition, what we tend to find is that that can take varying amounts of time. And depending on your organization's desire to wait. Some of us have more patient organizations and some of us have less patient organizations. They may want to not wait very long before they start to see some of the progress or that future state. So one of the things I recommend level setting at the beginning along with defining current state is talking to your key stakeholders to understand how long that transition state is actually going to take and what that looks like so that they have a clear understanding going in. And then you want to talk about what is the future going to look like and level set as well. A lot of times people will say that they aren't satisfied when the change is complete. One of the reasons that occurs is because what the future state was supposed to be was never actually documented. You basically need three things in order to implement a change. So there's three prerequisites, one being understanding what your motivation is for making that change, understanding what your vision is, so what you want it to look like when you're done, and then the last piece is your actual architecture of how you want to implement that change. And the key takeaway from this slide for everyone should be if you're trying to implement a change right now, that you need to really document that current state of what your current state of your organization looks like and before you make that change. What a lot of people end up doing is they start moving on to building a future state without clearly documenting and getting agreement around what your current state looks like. Now the challenge to that is a lot of times what happens is you start making changes and everyone forgets or doesn't understand what current state looked like. So it's important to really document that current state so that you can get to where you want to be. It's also important to make sure that you understand what your transition time frame will be and how long it'll actually take to transition to the future state. Many executives and organizations have a different level of tolerance for transitioning and that transition state. So it's very key to understand from your stakeholders how long they're willing to wait for a change to take effect. So some of them will say, I want to see something within the first few weeks. Some will say it's a few months. Some will say it's within a year. You need to clearly define what that period is that they have an aptitude to wait for so that you're setting expectations up front of how long it'll actually take you to get to that future state. The other key piece to understand when doing change is what your organizational culture is and looks like. The impact of organizational culture is actually huge on whether or not changes are successful. So attempting to introduce changes that are dramatically different than your current existing culture usually fail. Attempting to introduce changes that are generally consistent with your organizational culture usually are successful. So again, there's going to be exceptions to those rules, but what you need to do is clearly understand your current organizational culture to see if the change you're attempting to implement will fit. To give you an example, a few years back, everyone was very into doing CMMI, Six Sigma, a lot of the very rigorous regimented processes and implementing those in their organizations. They worked extremely well in certain organizations, and there was other organizations who spent lots of effort, energy, years, time, and money on implementing those and didn't end up seeing the value of those changes and actually don't use much of that today. A lot of when you deep dive into why that didn't work, part of it was their implementation architecture, how they went about it. Part of it could have been their aptitude for wanting to wait through that transition phase, but the other piece was it didn't match their underlying culture of the organization. The way that the organization was rewarded and behaved didn't match the desired outcome of what they were trying to achieve. So there was a lot of organizations who said, we need to get more structured. We're very unstructured. We have a very chaotic way of introducing releases into our environment. We don't have structured release processes. We don't know what's coming in. We don't have clearly defined roles in our organizations. We need to create that. So they thought this was an attempt to do that. The problem was that culture was fundamentally unstructured and wasn't receptive to the change, so it fights back against that type of change. So with Agile, with any of the things that you guys are trying to do, maybe it's continuous integration, introducing Agile, introducing new concepts around how you want to test and what you want to test, introducing BDD, those types of things, you should look at your culture and understand if the change you're attempting to make fits that culture. And when I talk about culture, what I'm really talking about is, you know, at the bottom of there where you see the triangles, it's all around your beliefs, your behaviors, and your assumptions. So again, looking at, you know, what are the underlying beliefs that your organization holds in terms of how they operate? What are the behaviors that are exhibited in your organization? And then what are the assumptions that people in your organization come with when they work inside the organization? So again, you know, looking at those beliefs, behaviors, and assumptions. In the larger class that I go through, we actually take time to assess your organizational culture and understand if the change you're trying to make will match that culture and to what level you're going to get a match. Because that, again, will impact your ability to be successful in the change that you're attempting to make. Now, I like to think of culture this way because I think visuals are good and it helps us understand what we're looking at. So, to me, culture is pieces you see above the surface. It's like an iceberg. So you'll see behaviors and beliefs in organizations. You'll see the outward manifestation of how people react in a certain environment. You'll see things that they hold true or kind of the beliefs that they have in that culture. Then there's going to be what I call things below the surface, or things that aren't as readily visible in your culture or about your culture in your organization, that it takes more time to learn. So if some of you are newer to an organization, it may actually take you longer to understand some of these things below the surface. So when we first get into a new organization or a new team, we can watch the behaviors, we can see what people believe in, what they hold as important things for them in the organization, but it's sometimes harder to get to expectations, assumptions, norms, and values. Those things sometimes take more time to develop. So often when people start in new organizations, they want to start influencing and being able to make change, but they don't yet understand some of those things that are kind of hidden below the surface around, what's going on in the organization and why is this happening and what are the underlying factors causing that to happen. When you want to make change, it's important to dig down below the surface to understand more around norms, assumptions, expectations, and values in the organization that you're impacting. Because again, that goes back to relatively how successful will your change be based on your understanding of this. Now, people who've been in organizations a long time have developed this over time. If you're newer to an organization, there are cultural surveys where you can go and gather some of this, what I call tribal knowledge, from the organization and understand better what the culture is below the surface. Otherwise, good resources are people who've been in the organization a while, understand fundamentally how it works, understand what some of those things are that drive the organization. So again, key component when you're starting your change, understand your culture that you're dealing with. The next thing to consider is your own values. So as a change agent or someone who wants to make change in an organization, you have to assess what your own values are and your proposed initiatives, what kind of your core beliefs are around what drives an organization to success. So understanding your own values and what initiatives you want to propose, you can then say, do these align fundamentally to my organization's culture? We've probably all seen it. We join new organizations, new companies, and we get inside those companies and it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like a fit to us. We don't feel like the culture matches who we are. So we may be someone who loves change, we're open to new ideas, we're open to trying new things, and you get inside an organization that's very resistant. They don't want to make change. They don't want to try something new. It's very hard to get them to see a different way of doing things, and that really doesn't align to who you are and your values. So I would say as people who are interested in change and trying new things, always constantly assess, do your values and the things that you want to put forth in the organization match the culture of the organization that you're working in? Where you're going to have the most success and feel the most successful is when your values and the things that you believe in deeply align to that of the organization that you're a part of. You're going to find it's easier to get things done. You're going to find it's easier to get support for the things that you're trying to do. For all of those out there in quality assurance for any period of time, you've probably run into, there's varying schools of thought around the importance of quality in an organization. There's some organizations who would say quality assurance and testing is a necessary evil, we have to do it. And then there's other organizations who see it as core to their ability to deliver successfully to their customers. And it's central to what they do. And you're going to see everything running the gamut in between there. So what I always say is, look at it from the perspective of what type of organization fits you best, what type of organization fits the initiatives that you would like to see implemented, the types of things that get you excited about your job and what you're doing, and then align those two things together. So some of the ways to get this information for yourself and to think about it after this session, because we don't have a lot of time, but what I would suggest is taking just a little poll, and if you have a chance right now, write down some of these things or answers to these questions that I'm asking, because it'll help you determine that culture again. So just kind of jotting down, what are the norms in your organization? What do people value in your organization? Some people value the capability to be a firefighter and quickly step in and resolve issues. Some organizations value proactive planning, people that can see the long-term vision and strategy and then implement that. So again, can be very dramatically different. I will also tell you culture can vary inside of teams within organizations. So there may be an overriding organizational culture, but then within different groups or teams inside of an organization, that could vary dramatically. There is a major retailer that I have worked with for many years, and they're making a ton of change right now. They had some severe issues around security in the recent past here, and they've also had several changes in leadership, and they're going through a massive cultural change. And even if you look inside of what they're trying to build as their new defining culture, if you look inside, say, the IT organization versus the marketing organization versus the buying organization, you're going to see different cultures that reside and are predominant inside of those worlds. So depending on what type of change you're making and how many people you're actually impacting, so are you going to impact IT, the business, customers, marketing, who do you have to touch? Look at the culture of those organizations to also understand, does that change align not only maybe to your team, but to the other teams that are impacted? Because that is also going to have a predominant factor on success based on their ability of those organizations and those teams to uptake the change that you're requesting. The other thing to think about is, how easy is it for someone else outside your team or your company to see what the culture is? Do you have a culture that's pretty on the surface and it's very visible? Some organizations will have one that's harder to determine. It's more underlying. So you see not as much on the surface. Most of it's kind of underneath in these, traditional norms and things that have evolved over time. So think about how easy it is to actually determine your culture. And then I always say it's always best to boil things down into simple things you can remember. So you want to create something simple for you to categorize and understand your culture. So at the end of the day, once you've said, here's what I think my culture is, you should be able to put it into 3 words that describe your culture and 2 words that describe your company's or your team's approach to change. So you should be able to say, here's the 3 words that describe the culture of the organization I work for, and I gave you an example of this organization says we're fast-paced, we have top talent, and we're bleeding edge. So 3 words or 3 phrases, I would say, that kind of encapsulate what your organization is, and then 2 words around how you approach change. And in this case, this organization is in constant change. So they always want to be moving forward, always looking for new opportunities and ways of doing things. So again, jot these down, and then when you have some additional time in your day, think about, what does this look like for your organization, and how would you actually describe your organization when it comes to your culture, and then how you approach change. Some organizations will actually say, you know what, we're very open to change, but when you actually dig under the surface and you ask them, well, are you okay then with, changing this up, or are you okay with this, and you give them different items of what could be changed, they'll go, well, no, we really don't want to change that, or no, we really don't want to change that either. And what you'll actually find is that they're not as open as they think they are to change. One of the activities I love to do in classrooms when we talk about change is ask people after they've been in the room for about this amount of time. So we've been together now for almost 25 minutes. I'll say, why don't you get up and select a new seat in the room? Now, many of you who have been to conferences or events realize that many people come early just to select their seat in the room. It's a room they're going to be in maybe for an hour, maybe for 4 hours, maybe for the day, but it's not permanent. It's a temporary situation. And yet, they will come early to get the seat that they want in particular. It could be because they like to sit in front so they can see the slides. It could be, you know, you pick this seat because you have the ability to hear the presenter better. Whatever it is, there's kind of our own norms and values and beliefs around where we like to be in a room when we have someone who's presenting. And when I ask them to change, you would think that I've asked them to change something fundamental to who they are. Because even though they've only been in that seat for less than 30 minutes, they've established ownership. And when we establish ownership of something, we're more resistant to wanting to change, right? So think about that for yourself. Now, we won't physically do the exercise, obviously, but if you had already come into a room, selected your seat, and after 30 minutes someone said, go pick a new one, you can't have the seat you're in, right? Many people are resistant, even though we would classify ourselves as being open to change. So keep that in mind. A lot of times when we're asking people to make change, it's something much more personal to them than even just a seat they selected in a room that they're going to have for less than a day. It's something around fundamentally how they do their work. It's their, you know, it could be their way they do their development process. It could be their source code control tools. It could be their quality assurance tools and testing tools that they're using. Those things are much more personal. And those are things people have used for years, if not most of their career. So you tend to find that people are very resistant to change things that are very personal to them that they've grown accustomed to. So change is about, obviously, three things. It's about the people that are involved in it. It's about the technology that you're asking potentially to use to implement that change. And then it's about the process of how you actually have to go about doing whatever it is you're asking them to do. It's pretty easy today with the internet and access to technology and Google and everything that we've got to get information on what's the best way to do it. So what's the best process out there? You can go out there and find lots of advice on various topics on moving to agile methodologies, around scrum teams, around you name it. You can probably find something out there on what process should I use to go about make this change. You can also find a lot of information about what tools are available and which technologies would probably work best when trying to make that change. Those things, not so challenging or difficult to be able to figure out. Where the biggest variable is, and that we oftentimes underestimate in change, is the people. The biggest component is people. We all have our own viewpoints, opinions, how we view things, how we like to get information, and how we like to receive communication. People will make and break those changes. You can have the best process. You can have the cutting edge technology. But if you don't have people who are willing to support it and willing to implement those changes from a process and a technology perspective, the change falls down. So you need to make sure that the people are aligned, both from your organizational change management, so how you're actually achieving that, as well as your organizational alignment. So if you're making a fundamental change to how you're asking people to do things, you want the reward structure to match what you're trying to have them do. So you want to make sure that there's incentives for them to actually change, and that your incentives and the way that you reward your organization align to what those changes are. Now what you're going to see, and what I like to talk about, is 3 different types of change, and how to classify whatever it is you're trying to do into one of these 3 types of change. So think about for yourselves. Obviously you guys were interested in learning about change for a reason. You may have an initiative that you're thinking of right now that you want more feedback on how to go about doing it. So think about those initiatives that you've got kind of in the back of your head, or maybe actively engaged in, that you want to work with in your organizations. Put them into one of these buckets. The first bucket is around team synergies in process and tools. A lot of times what happens, and we all may have been involved in this at one point in our careers, is there's acquisitions and mergers that take place. More and more we're seeing that. AT&T just bought DirecTV. So, there's lots of mergers and acquisitions. Medtronic in the med device space just bought Covidien to augment their offerings. Oracle buys companies on a weekly almost basis and acquires things. Lots of organizations out there are in heavy acquisition and merger mode. So what you tend to find is they have to make change because now we've acquired these new people, these new technologies, these new things. We've got to rationalize, figure out what we're keeping, figure out what we're not keeping. And that gets really personal in and of itself because teams get very aligned to what they're comfortable with and their tools. So when they're asked to change, it's very personal again to them. So you have to be careful when you're going about a team synergy where you're saying, we want to just synergize our processes, we want to reduce the number of tools we're using. You have to be conscious of the fact that those tools, while they may realize they're not the best tool and that they really kind of like one that another team's using, it becomes very personal and it's an ownership-based emotional decision. So you have to take the emotion out of those types of changes and make it around how can I rationalize the value of the tool itself and what the process does for us as an organization. So there's a different type of communication you're going to need to use when you're talking about team synergies in process and tools as a change that you want to make. The second type of change is around creating new paradigms. So different than the first one. First one, again, due to usually mergers and acquisitions, but also could be, you've grown from a small startup to a larger organization, and now you need more tools and process to help you drive. You can't go as ad hoc as you used to in the past because now you're larger. You have more things to think about. You have more people involved in that. The second piece is around creating new paradigms. This is about developing new ways to add value or to improve customer satisfaction. A lot of times what's happening now is technology is changing very quickly. So we have to find new ways to add value or delight customers and improve their satisfaction. Things that 6 months ago or a year ago were things that would do this may no longer. We think, for example, I'll give an example of something that used to be a new advancement that now we take for granted that we just assume should work. So pay at the pump. When you go to a gas station, you don't, when they've instituted pay at the pump, you no longer have to walk into the gas station, pay for your gas. You have a way to do it right there outside. A convenience factor for all of us who lead very busy lives, don't have time, to even spend that extra 2 or 3 minutes to go inside the gas station and then get back out to our cars. What happens now, that was a new thing years ago, but today, people, when they go to a gas station, if it doesn't have pay at the pump, they may not go to that one and go down the street to the next one just to ensure they could get one that does have pay at the pump. It becomes an expectation. Same way with other things, right? So we tend to find that we have to create new paradigms when consumers or our own business units or users have decided that that's an expectation now. So you have to find a way to add more value or do it in a different way. That would be the second one. The last type of change is around strategic planning. This has a lot to do with new competitors in your space, organizational changes that occur. So say, for example, you've got all brand new leadership at the top of your organization, and that new leadership has different values or different directions they want to take the organization from the people who are in place before. So they're asking you to shift directions. They've got a new strategic vision for the organization, and you now need to go that direction. Many of you may be familiar with Target Corporation. They're a Minneapolis-based retailer. Target owns stores all over the country. Target did a foray into Canada. So Target had developed Target Canada. New leadership came in, said we're not making money on Target Canada. We're going to stop that. We no longer strategically want to invest in it, and we're going to shut that down. So new plan, new change required based on the strategy of leadership coming in and saying, no longer our vision, we're going to shut that down. It also could be there's new competitors in your space. So Nielsen Group and Nielsen Companies does the surveying for organizations, right? So you get the TV surveys that tell you what people are watching. Now, companies like HBO, DirecTV, the providers themselves can provide some of that information. Companies that used to be able to provide that service now have new competitors in their space when they may have been the only ones in that space before. So you have to think about, okay, how are we going to offer value now that we have other people in our market space who may be doing similar types of things? How do we change and add value in that way? So 3 different ways to think about the changes. A lot of times when we talk about technology, lots of them fall into the first bucket around we need to create new processes or tools, but they can also fall into creating new paradigms or strategic planning as well. I always say when you're making change, make sure you have some rules of engagement with the folks that are involved in the change. So just like with projects or anything that you embark on, it's always good to understand what your rules of engagement are. So a couple of things. This is just a sample of what you could use. A couple that I like to talk about is the 3rd bullet, which is all change involves personal choice. Make sure it makes sense to people. At the end of the day, a lot of times we'll say, well, they have to do it. Well, no one really has to do it. It's all about personal choice. They can choose to leave the organization. They can choose to resist and not do it and fight it as long as they can and then leave the organization. But understand that it is a choice and that it does need to make sense to people. So that is going to require some communication if you want it to be successful. The other thing that I like to point out is involvement breeds commitment. In terms of change, getting your biggest resistors involved is very important because a lot of times the reason they're resisting is they have some underlying fear or some underlying belief about what's going to happen if this change takes place. You want to tap into that. A lot of times what we tend to want to do with resistors is to ignore them, to just put them off to the side and say, they're resisting, they're not going to get on board, we just need to ignore them and plow ahead. What you actually need to do is engage them. Get them involved. Understand deeper and ask the question, why? Why is this so important? Why do we have to do it this way? And truly listen and understand. What our tendency can be is we have such our own perspective on what it should be that we don't always listen. And it's important to keep an open mind and actually listen to what they're saying, because a lot of times you'll learn the most from people who have very different beliefs and viewpoints from your own. So I would say take note of people who have, in a meeting, dramatically different opinion from you and understand why. That'll teach you more not only about what you're trying to do, but what potentially the risks or the pitfalls are of what you're trying to do, because they may have thought of those things already. And then the last one, wanting to make sure if you are making a change, it's not for change's sake. So a lot of times I've talked to leaders and executives in organizations who have read a magazine or a book or an article, or have talked to another friend of theirs who's a CEO of another organization, and they've said, well, they're doing it, so it must be good for us, and we should be doing it. You need to actually make sure that it's going to result in tangible benefits or increased capacity, some type of benefit for your organization. And as I mentioned earlier, not every change fits every culture. So a change that works in company A won't necessarily work as well in company B. And even you, if you've been in another organization and something worked really, really well, you know you can go to another organization and it works completely differently. And a lot of that has to do with the culture of that organization, how it's structured, the way they've set up their incentives, lots of things. So make sure when you're looking at changes that it actually makes sense and it's going to result in something that's going to be of benefit, or it's going to help increase your capacity. You're going to see something out of it. What's also important to understand is even if someone receives a change as positive, So you may be someone who says, wow, this is a really good thing. I'm excited about it. I really want to do this. There's still a point where they're pessimistic about that. So in the beginning, what you'll see is uninformed optimism from someone who sees it as a positive. So what tends to happen is in the beginning of a change, people that like change and are open to it will go, oh, this is going to be really neat, but I don't really know a lot at this point. We're not sure what the details are or how that's actually going to look. But they have this huge burst of optimism based on not really knowing, but kind of liking the concept, right? So it's all about, I love the concept. I'm not sure how that's actually going to work in practice. And then as you go through, they'll get more information. As they get that information, they'll probably go through a point where they kind of have this informed pessimism of, wow, is that really going to work as well as I think it is? So even if they're on board, there's going to probably be a point where some of your people who are your biggest advocates have a moment of pause and go, wow, will this actually work for us? And you're going to have to talk them through that. So just know you're going to encounter that at some point, even for people that are on board in the beginning with you, that there will come a point where they may go, I'm not so sure anymore. You've got to get them over that hump. So you've got to get them to the point of, hope and hopeful realism. Once they really understand what it means, they want to be hopeful about the future and the advantages it's going to create for them. And then you want to move them to informed optimism and confidence of, yep, this change is actually going to work. It's going to be good for us. The organization's going to be better off. My job's going to be easier. And then when you get to the end, hopefully they're satisfied and say, yeah, you know what? This worked out really well. I like what I do more. I feel more informed. I feel more involved. I feel more engaged. And they have a satisfaction from, this change really worked, and I think it was a good idea. I'm glad we did this. Now, here's what you see, which is very different from someone who perceives a change positively. The emotional response that you'll tend to see to a negatively perceived change is different. So, for example, when companies announce a merger and acquisition or potential layoffs coming, what happens, and we've all probably felt it in some way when we've negatively perceived something, is this immobilization. I call it this time where nothing gets done. Everyone is just sitting around waiting to see what's going to happen because they're unsure and they're not feeling confident about what the future holds. So there's this period of initial immobilization. And that could be around, they've just announced we're merging with another company, they've announced they're decentralizing QA, we're all going to report to our business units, whatever that may be. But if people perceive that as negative, there's this period of immobilization where nothing is getting done. Then after people get out of that and they have a little more information and time passes, it usually transitions to something of denial. So we'll use the example of we're changing out our test case management tool. They've announced that because of the acquisition, no longer are we going to have 2 test case management tools. We're all moving to 1 tool. And you're someone that is going to have to leave your tool that you've used for the last 5 years. So initially, it's like, what do I do? Do I keep writing test cases? How long am I going to get to put them in there? You have this period of, I don't know what to do. As time passes and they start to tell you more about what that's going to look like, we tend to see people move into that denial where you're like, well, they're never going to be able to migrate all that out of that old system. It'll never happen. I know they want to do it, but it's not going to happen, right? And we all go through that period of this just really isn't going to take place. Then what we tend to see after that denial, and we know it is happening, and we've seen them start to decommission user IDs and people aren't no longer going to have access and they're shutting down projects inside of that tool, we get angry. We get mad, right? And we go, I'm not going to be on board with this. I am not on board with this change. I'm angry that we're doing this. I don't want to do this. I flat out refuse to use the new tool, right? We get angry. And we've probably all either had someone, if you're a leader, report to you, go through these phases, you felt this happen to them, or we've experienced it ourselves. Then next after that anger is the bargaining phase. And again, you've probably seen this before. well, what if I just use my test case management tool for one more project? Just give me one more project and then I'll get off of it, I promise. I promise I won't use it anymore, but I have this really critical project coming up and I need to use my tool one more time. So just let me do that, right? So you go into, if it's happening, I at least want to control when. I want to control what the state looks like and what the future looks like, and I want to control when that change is going to happen to me. When we realize that that's not going to happen and that we have to change no matter what, we go into kind of this depression of, oh my gosh, this is really happening. I'm really going to have to do this. I'm going to have to use a new tool. Then we go into this phase of testing. It's like any of you who have small children. It's what children do. They test the limits and the boundaries of how far can they get, trying to do what they want to do. So they'll test trying to say, well, what if I just use it for my own internal tracking? I'm not using it for tracking corporate projects. I'm just going to use it for my stuff. So they'll try and test kind of those limits. And then eventually they'll come to acceptance. Now, acceptance doesn't mean they're going to do what you want them to do. What acceptance means is they've come to the conclusion it is the direction the organization's going, and that maybe they don't fit that organization anymore, and they start looking for a new job, they start deciding they need to leave, they want to change groups. So don't equate acceptance in this scenario to compliance and doing what you want, or the fact that they're going to be okay with it. That's not what it means at all. So keep in mind, watch resistors for that acceptance phase and what that actually means to them to understand if they're really on board. For you guys that are trying to make change, there's some factors that are really critical for you to remember. So anyone who's trying to implement change needs to be open-minded. It's important to have the ability to respect differing frames of reference. So you need to be able to be open-minded to different frames of reference in terms of, how you view things and how you view change. So you have to be open in terms of your opinions and being open to other people's opinions. You need to be good at developing plans of action, because when you're making change, people want to know, what are we going to have to do? What is this going to look like? So you have to be good at putting it to action. Lots of people get great ideas, but they can't put them into action. You have to be able to put them into action. You have to be able to establish synergistic relationships. So understand the underlying politics in your organization. What things have to work together? Who is critical that you need to work with and get buy-in from? Who do you need to make sure that you're connecting with on a regular basis to touch in and make sure they're okay with the change? Remember that not everyone receives communication and messages the same way. So you are going to have to get very good at communicating in multiple ways to people. Some people prefer things documented, emails, all kinds of written communication. Other people are going to want you to personally touch them and tell them about what is happening. They're going to want that personal attention as you're making the change. So not one type of communication will work for all people. If you want everyone on board, you're going to have to vary the style of communication that you're using. You're going to want to build commitment from people, not just a one-time commitment, but an ongoing commitment. You're going to have to anticipate and manage the resistance that's coming. It's not a strategy to just ignore resistance. You have to anticipate it's going to come, no matter how good the idea is. People will not be on board, so you're going to have to anticipate and manage that. And then understand power versus influence. So there's people in organizations who have power, and that may be because they're in leadership roles. And then there's other people who may not have the title, but they have a lot of influence. We've probably all known these people. There's people that have historically been in an organization a long time. They have a lot of relationships with key people. They have a lot of influence, even though technically they don't have a title that would denote they have a lot of actual power that's been granted by the organization. So understand the difference between power and influence when you're trying to make change. You want to make sure that you're getting the people in power on board, who are the stakeholders, as well as the influencers, who influence others and others look to see how they're going to react to the change. So what comes next? Once you've identified if your change you want to make fits your culture, which we talked about in the beginning, right? So does your change you want to make fit your culture? And once you've selected an initiative that aligns to that culture and you determine that it's going to be a good fit culturally, your next biggest piece is going to be all around your communication strategy. And the next thing that will determine your successes or failures around the plan and the strategy to communicate that out to people. Because remember we said in the beginning, it's all about the people and getting them on board and helping them understand what you need them to do and how this change impacts them. So don't underestimate how much time has to be spent on actually just communicating the plan and the strategy out to the people that are impacted most by the change. What they actually say around communication, which I think is very interesting, is very little is about what you're actually saying. The majority of what people take away from us is who we're saying it to and how they receive that communication. So very little is actual words we give to people. The majority of what they're interpreting is things like the tone of our voice, our body language, their interpretation of what we just said. Now, we've all probably had this. If any of you have children, you've experienced this. You can ask them a question and say, did you clean your room? And when you ask that question, the answer may be, yeah. Now, they've said yeah, but what that can actually mean is absolutely no, I haven't done that yet, right? So based on the tone of their voice, how they say it, and the body language when they're telling you that, it may give you a totally different meaning about what they're telling you. That's what they're talking about here. You as change agents have to be as careful about how you message as to what you message. So what they actually hear in the message itself equates for a small percentage. It's a lot about how you're telling them, what they're perceiving as you're telling them, and what their history is when someone else has told them similar information in the past. So what you have to remember in organizations is people have probably come to these developers, these testers, everyone, and said, we're going to try this new thing before. And that may have worked or may not have worked. So they have a predisposed notion of how realistic it is that this change is actually going to occur. So it's really important to understand that as you're trying to make a change in an organization and work with people to get them to do something different than what they're doing today. So again, think about that communication strategy. Think about who you're saying it to, what their interpretation of it is going to be, especially for those of you that communicate globally. There's different norms and standards depending on who you're communicating with and what their cultural norms are. So understand that. Understand your cultural norms for the organization that you are working with as well. Now, how we perceive the world is different depending on where we come from. We all have different ways that we view the world. And each of us has a different standard for how we look at things in terms of that. So I'll give you an example just to show you perception is reality. When I show you this guy, he's become much more popular lately with the presidential election. He either elicits some type of emotion right now for people, especially being involved with the elections. So either you look at that and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe you showed that, or, you know, I really like him, or he's great, or, you know, or negative feelings, right? So we all have a perception, but that perception's different. I showed you the same thing, but you're all going to think something different about it based on where you come from, your perception of it, and your viewpoint. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with people on change. They're going to have a different perception of it depending on where they're coming from. This I will show you is a map. This map is used in textbooks. This map is how it's depicted. This map is actually used in textbooks in Europe. So Europe, and if you look at some of the countries, they look abnormally large compared to what they actually are. Then I'll show you another textbook used in classrooms as well. This one developed in the United States. If you actually look at, again, some of the countries here are normally out of proportion to what it actually is, with the United States looking as big as all of Europe, for example. Then this one is one of my favorites. This is actually used in textbooks in Australia, where they got sick of I was being the one that was upside down and everyone else right side up. So they flipped the whole map and put themselves right side up and everyone else upside down. So it's all about perception, right? And as we grow up, we get to see different things as our norms and our values, and we'll perceive the world a different way based on that. So again, make sure you have a way to communicate. Change is about people. Understand their perceptions, understand their underlying beliefs. Make sure you focus on personal, interpersonal, and team communication that's going to work for your organization. Provide a simple framework and a common language. So make sure that people align visually and verbally to what you're saying. So create as many visuals as you can about what you're asking them to do as you verbally tell them. It makes a lot more sense to people when they see it, because a lot of people are very visual as opposed to verbal. Make sure you understand yourself and what type of person you actually are. It's going to give you better insight into the others that you're actually trying to change at the end of the day. And then I'll pose a question to you guys around communication and just when you're trying to make changes in general. What percentage of business issues are due to the lack of interpersonal communication skills and not the actual capabilities or competencies of the parties? So what this is really saying is, what percentage of time do we have issues in our day-to-day work? Not because the people can't do their job, but because we either can't communicate what we want them to do, or they don't understand from us what we're asking. It's actually 87% of the time that happens. So a large percentage of the time, it has little to do with people not being able to do their job, and it has mostly to do with the ability of us or them to communicate effectively with each other. In conclusion, we talked about it in the beginning, cost of failure in organizations is high. They'll lose confidence in leadership, management, and the people asking to make change if you can't successfully fulfill the promises you announced or the intentions that you had for them. You need to make sure your change aligns to your culture. You need to be aware and manage resistance actively. Target your communications by personality type. And lastly, ensure you have adequate sponsorship. Make sure that you have the sponsorship from your senior leadership in your organization to lead that change, and that they're willing to make the changes necessary around compensation and reward structure in your organization as well to align to that. All right. And in conclusion, we'll wrap it up. We have a few minutes to take questions if there's any questions out there. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to Eric.
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't see any questions right now. Maybe we'll do just a few seconds here, see if anyone has a question or two.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and I encourage everyone to sign up if you haven't already for the conference in San Diego. There will be a lot of great sessions out there on this topic and others related to quality, so it's a good opportunity to meet with a lot of your peers. So I hope to see a lot of you there.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your time today, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can also follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great day.